if they could just imagine going up into a battle, into Ypres. There are no trenches. The whole ground had been saturated with shelling. Everything was shell holes. There were no trees, there was nothing, not a hedge, not a blade of grass. And each shell hole was touching the other. And the way you made a trench was to dig between one shell hole and another. That's the kind of living you made. And don't forget, half these shell holes covered in water, covered in blood, covered in something. There's mules, dead men, legs, arms, everything.
Between the trenches lay a place no soldier wished to cross, a barren strip of earth, scarred by shell fire, littered with wire and shadows. They called it no man's land. It was not just geography, it was a frontier between life and death, between the known and the unknowable. Here men whispered of ghostly figures drifting through the mist, of phantom lights that danced above the mud, of comrades who swore they saw visions before their final breath. And yet, amid the terror, soldiers clung to charms and tokens, a coin, a crucifix, a photograph tucked close to the heart, small anchors of hope in a world where luck seemed the only law. It was a strip of earth that varied in width, sometimes a few hundred yards, sometimes only a few dozen. It was churned by high explosives, poisoned by gas, and tangled with the rust of barbed wire. But if you look at the diaries, the letters home, and the whispered legends of the Canadian Corps, you realize that name isn't quite right. It wasn't that no man was there. It was that the men who were there weren't always entirely alive. Thank you for joining me here on my podcast. I'm your host, Samantha McCrae, and this is Memory and Valor. Tonight, we are stepping up onto the fire step to look out into the dark. We are exploring the supernatural, the eerie, and the unexplained myths of the Great War's most terrifying landscape, no man's land. Understand the ghosts of the Great War, you have to first understand the ground they haunted. No man's land wasn't just a battlefield, it was a liminal space, sort of a threshold between worlds where the living and the dead seemed to mingle, where the veil was thin. By 1916, the drainage systems of Flanders had collapsed under relentless shelling, and you have to remember the water table was very low in this area of the land. What had once been farmland was transformed into a lunar wasteland, craters filled with stagnant water, mud that swallowed boots, bodies alike, and shattered trees standing like blackened sentinels. Canadian soldiers stood sentry in this abyss for hours at a time, staring into the dark void between the lines. And in that state, exhausted, sleep deprived, and adrenalized, the mind began to betray its owner. A swaying piece of wire became a beckoning hand. A jagged stump became a crouching enemy. The imagination, sharpened by fear, painted phantoms onto the landscape. In the trenches, men spoke of strange feelings that came before death, a chill in the air, a sudden heaviness in the chest, or the uncanny certainty that tomorrow would never come. These were not dismissed as nerves or imagination. To those who lived it, they felt real, warnings whispered by forces beyond the battlefield. Stories spread of soldiers who predicted their own end with eerie accuracy. A man would write his last letter home, convinced he would not survive the next attack, and by dawn, he was gone. Others spoke of dreams where comrades appeared, already dead, beckoning them away from danger or toward it. For some, these experiences were framed as divine intervention, guardian spirits offering protection. For others, they were darker, like omens, shadows, or the presence of something hunting in no man's land. The war blurred the line between the living and the dead, and in that twilight space, premonitions became part of the soldier's reality. Perhaps they were not simply coping mechanisms. Perhaps they were supernatural events, moments when the veil between the worlds thinned and the soldiers glimpsed what lay beyond. Humphrey Sparrow served as acting lieutenant colonel in the Royal Berkshire Regiment and was remembered for rallying men under fire and leaving behind vivid testimony of trench combat. He was awarded the DSO, which is the Distinguished Service Order, and the Military Cross for bravery under fire. He spoke to the BBC in 1964 about superstitions, premonitions, and intuition in the First World War.
Then suddenly a shell fell into the trench. And I thought, well, now our time has come. I said to myself, I've had a long run for your money, and I wonder what it'll be like to be dead. At that moment, I realized that whatever happened, I wasn't going to be killed. Now, it's impossible to describe this consciousness. It's not like ordinary consciousness at all. It is such, I suppose, something like a prophet of old when the Lord spoke, in that kind of consciousness, something quite overwhelmingly clear and convincing. And it didn't give me, I wasn't very proud of myself because I didn't care what happened to the others. I was going to survive. And I took a rifle and I began shooting, and 2 Germans were 600 yards, and I made a third skip for his life. And the advance continued. But the extraordinary part was this, that machine gun never fired again, that was the last shell that gun fired. There was no reason why it should stop. And the attack on our front, and not on the flanks, petered out. It's just so dried up. Never came near us. It was as though, for a moment, I got a glimpse of time coming towards me, as though something, I don't know what it was, something held up that attack. And that was a great and strange feeling.
Countless soldiers recalled their experiences and their first encounters with no man's land and the vibe it gave off, the feelings it gave them, and the eeriness of the area. Private Jim Broomhead of the 46th Battalion South Saskatchewan Regiment remembered his first encounter with no man's land at Pozières. Quote, I got my first glimpse of death and stench at Pozières. The dead had not been removed, and they were piled 3 deep. Our barbed wire hung full of dead Canadians and Germans like birds on telephone wires. End quote. For Broomhead, the battlefield was not just a place of combat, it was a graveyard where the living and the dead were inseparable. Lieutenant Fred Wells recalled a moment of dark humor amid the horror. He said, quote, along the road was an unburied hand of a soldier. Some of our wags would pretend to shake it. A bit of humor along the way, end quote. Even in the face of death, soldiers found ways to laugh. Gallows humor became a shield against despair, and the men of World War I really had their own brand of gallows humor, trench humor, as it was also called, and we can talk about that in another episode. But there are several accounts, interestingly, of men shaking the hands of dead men as they filed through the trench or marched down the road. Often when the trenches were being dug, you would find, unfortunately, you would uncover with your entrenching tool the remains of a soldier who had died previously and was buried, and you would just have to kind of continue digging, and oftentimes this would leave limbs or bones exposed in the trench walls. So this was not an uncommon, though it's macabre, it was not an uncommon thing. Private Edward John Richards of the 52nd Battalion captured the eerie silence of night patrols. He said, quote, halt, who goes there? My God, what an awful place. I didn't get an answer, but I'm sure I saw a face. The ghosts of men that lie there are walking again tonight. End quote. For Richards, no man's land was not just a physical space, it was haunted, alive with the presence of those who had fallen. And Corporal William Miller of the PPCLI, aka the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, remembered his comrade Sergeant Donald MacDonald of the 10th Battalion. Miller said, "Donald, you're going to get hell for eating those rations." And MacDonald replied, "Bill, I'm not coming back." The next day, MacDonald was killed. His words became a chilling prophecy, echoing the fatalism that many soldiers carried with them. Private Amos Mays wrote home about a strange feeling before battle. Quote, "It seems strange that one should have the premonition of coming events. The night before I was hit, I had the feeling, which I could not get rid of myself, that something was going to happen." End quote. And premonitions like this were common. Soldiers often sensed death before it arrived, as if the battlefield itself whispered warnings to them. Private William Green of the 13th Battalion Royal Highlanders of Canada reflected after the war, quote, "A lot of men had premonitions during the war of never coming home, and a lot of them, sorry to say, came true." End quote. For Private Green, these feelings weren't superstition. They were grim realities borne out by the staggering losses of the war. And finally, Lance Sergeant Frank Stanley Eram of the 8th Battalion, Winnipeg Rifles, described the uncanny presence of the dead. Quote, "You could feel the pulse of the thousands of the dead with their pale hands protruding through the mud. You could feel the presence of something not of this earth." End quote. Aram's words remind us that no man's land was more than a battlefield. It was this liminal space between life and death, between the living and the dead. And these voices from no man's land show us how soldiers confronted the unimaginable. They used humor, and through premonition and haunting encounters, they tried to make sense of a world where death was everywhere. Sometimes what they heard could not be explained away by nerves or wind. There were whispers carried across the mud, voices that seemed to belong to no one. There were cries that echoed long after the guns had fallen silent. Men swore they heard footsteps pacing just beyond the trench, though no patrol had been sent. In a place where half the men who entered never returned, the boundary between reality and superstition really blurred. No man's land became not only a killing ground, but a stage for visions, eerie, inexplicable, and unforgettable. And remember that the First World War had a very high casualty rate. By the end of the war, armies from both sides suffered a total of 37 million casualties, representing half of the men who enlisted. About 25% of them were killed. There is a veteran who has long passed, but back in the mid 1960s, I believe it was, he was interviewed by CBC. His interview is now preserved with Veterans Affairs Canada, but he is only referred to as Mr. Turner. And in this audio clip, he discusses the fatalism that crept into the soldiers' conversations.
You get scared, all right. You never know. We've had boys in battery that, they got talking about death and one thing and another. Several of them said they ain't going to come through. They feel as though they ain't going to come through. Well, they didn't. I know two in particular. One was a kind of a carpenter. He used to make crosses for those fellows that did die or killed. And so he made a mistake on one there, and he had to make another one. Well, that other one he was making us for himself, and he didn't know it. The other fella, he was killed. He was a Newfoundlander. He didn't always figured he wasn't going to come through. I would have to be behind him when he was killed. Three of us were going up to the top of Vimy Ridge to see what was on the other side. Well, the Germans were firing shells at the time, but they're all going way back overhead. We figured it was safe to go. Well, we hadn't gone far when one of those shells was coming right for us. I dropped to the ground, and I guess perhaps the other did, I don't know, but the middle fellow was killed. So you never know your...
There was a legend that circulated among the troops, British, Canadian, Australian, and German alike. Among the many myths born of trench warfare, few were as unsettling as the tales of the wild deserters or wild men. According to soldiers' stories, these were the men who had abandoned their armies. British, French, German, Canadian, Australian, even Italian, and banded together in the wastelands between the lines. The earliest printed accounts appeared after the war, describing these deserters as ghostly figures who vanished into the ruins of the Somme. Whether they were real men surviving in the shadows or simply a story born of fear and imagination, the wild men embodied the darkest possibilities of no man's land. The war could strip men of their humanity and turn them into predators among the dead. The wild men were said to be deserters from all sides, men who had renounced civilization entirely. They lived in collapsed trenches and deep shell caves, scavenging corpses for food, clothing, and weapons, emerging only at night. The wild men were often portrayed as cannibalistic, fighting among themselves over the spoils of the dead. While most historians view this as a chilling cautionary myth, propaganda to terrify troops out of deserting, it perfectly encapsulated the fear of regression, the ultimate loss of humanity that trench conditions threatened. Arthur Halm Beeman, a British cavalry officer, wrote of this in his 1920 memoir, The Squadron. He described the eerie feeling of looking out at no man's land and hearing, quote, inhuman cries and rifle shots coming from that awful wilderness as though the bestial denizens were fighting among themselves, end quote. So again, some historians will tell us that this was myth and a projection of soldiers' fears and of losing their civilization, yet the story persisted. Soldiers feared that if they stayed in the mud too long, they wouldn't just die, they would devolve. Indigenous soldiers carried their own frameworks of meaning, and some claimed that the wild men were not deserters at all, but the Wetigo. The spirit derived from Algonquin legend, though it is common among all the territories, not just in Canada, but in the US as well. The Wetigo was a devourer of flesh that haunted the wilderness. So whether it was the wild men or the Wetigo, these legends reveal something deeper than folklore. They were expressions of dread in a place where humanity itself seemed fragile. No man's land was not only a battlefield, it was a psychological frontier where soldiers confronted the possibility that survival might mean surrendering their humanity. So, if the wild men embodied the darkness of no man's land, there was also a desperate need for light, and it didn't take long. In the summer of 1914, the British Expeditionary Force, also known as the BEF, faced its first great trial of the war. At Mons, in Belgium, a small professional army of 80,000 men stood against a German force more than twice its size. The British fought bravely, but the sheer weight of numbers forced them into retreat. In fact, it was the longest retreat of the war. It was a moment of fear, exhaustion, and uncertainty. And then a legend was born. Rumors spread that something extraordinary had happened during the retreat. Some soldiers claimed they saw phantom bowmen, ghostly archers, raining arrows upon the Germans. Others swore they had seen angelic figures hovering in the sky, shielding the British troops from destruction. This story, known as the Angel of Mons, quickly became one of the most enduring myths of the First World War. But here's the twist. The legend didn't begin on the battlefield at all. It began in print. On September 29th, 1914, Welsh author Arthur Machen published a short story in the London Evening News. He called it The Bowman. In it, he imagined a soldier praying to St. George, who summoned a spectral archers to defend the British. Machen wrote it as fiction, but he wrote it in a documentary style, so convincing that readers mistook it for truth. Requests poured in from parish magazines and clergy, eager to reprint the tale. One priest even insisted Machen must be wrong, that the facts, quote unquote, were true, and he had merely embellished them. Machen later reflected, quote, "It seemed that my light fiction had been accepted by the congregation of this particular church as the solidest of facts. The snowball of rumor that was then set rolling has been rolling ever since, growing bigger and bigger, till it is now swollen to a monstrous size." End quote. Within months, the phantom bowmen had transformed into angels. Newspapers published illustrations of shining figures in the sky. Sermons declared that divine intervention had saved Britain's army. For a nation reeling from the horrors of modern war, the Angel of Mons offered comfort, reassurance, and a sense that God was on their side. Historians today see the legend as a mix of propaganda, rumor, and spiritual longing. You have to remember, this was a very Christian war in terms of not just the Allied side. There's little evidence that soldiers truly witnessed angels on the battlefield, but the story reveals something deeper. In the chaos of mechanized slaughter, people turned to myth to make sense of the unimaginable. The Angel of Mons was not just a tale of divine protection, it was a reflection of the fear, faith, and the desperate need for hope in a war that seemed to defy human comprehension. And in 1914, it had only just begun. And what makes the Angel of Mons so remarkable is how soldiers began to claim it as real. Some Tommies swore that they had seen St. George, England's warrior saint, riding to their aid. Others described St. Michael, sword gleaming in the smoke. A few insisted they saw 3 wonderful tall figures towering above the battlefield. For others, it was a brilliant light, a golden aura, or a cloud in which heroic shapes appeared, aided by phantom archers. One Canadian lance corporal recovering in hospital told his nurse of a strange light and 3 shapes over the German lines. He added firmly, quote, "I have a record of 15 years' good service, and I should be very sorry to make a fool of myself by telling a story merely to please anyone." End quote. Phyllis Campbell, a nurse serving in France, recorded tales of soldiers who claimed to see Joan of Arc or the Archangel Michael guiding them. In her memoir, Back to the Front, from 1915, she recounted one Lancashire Fusilier's testimony, quote, "First there was a sort of yellow mist rising before the Germans. Then a tall man with yellow hair, in golden armor, on a white horse, holding his sword up as if to say, 'Come on, boys, I'll put the kibosh on the devils.' The minute I saw it, I knew we were going to win." End quote. The legend did not fade with the war. Veterans carried it home. And decades later, in interviews and memoirs, they still spoke of it. In the 1920s and 1930s, letters published in the Occult Review and other journals described luminous clouds and shining beings. One veteran wrote, "Those who could see said they saw a row of shining beings between the 2 armies. Others recalled the cries of phantom bowmen or the sudden sense of strength when all seemed lost. These were not anonymous rumors anymore, they were memories, retold by men who had lived through the retreat and still believed that something extraordinary had happened. The legend spread rapidly beyond the trenches. Newspapers repeated it, clergy preached it, and families at home clung to it as proof that their sons were not abandoned in no man's land or in the mud, but watched over by heaven. For soldiers, the angel was more than a story. It was a shield the mind maybe created to protect the soul. And in the face of this slaughter, the legend offered transcendence. So the Angel of Mons tells us that legends are not just stories, they are survival mechanisms in many cases. Where the wild men embodied the fear of regression, the angels embodied the longing for divine intervention. Both were born from the same soil of no man's land, where men searched for meaning in chaos. The most chilling stories aren't the collective legends. They are the deeply personal ones, the stories of the third man, the presence that guides you when you are alone. And for this, we have a verified, specific account from one of Canada's most respected soldier writers, Will R. Bird. Will Bird served with the 42nd Battalion, the Black Watch of Canada. Before he enlisted, his brother Steve had been killed in action in 1915. In his memoir, aptly entitled Ghosts Have Warm Hands, Will writes about a conversation he had with Steve before he died. Steve had made him a promise. He said, "Bill, if there is anything I can do for you, just let me know. And if I don't come back, maybe I'll find a way to come sometime and whisper in your ear." Fast forward to 1917. Will Bird is near Vimy Ridge. He is exhausted, sleeping in a small dugout, a funk hole, while on duty, and it's the dead of night. I'm going to continue this story now. I'm going to read from Will Bird's book, Ghosts Have Warm Hands, and give you his exact wording. We snuggled in, and with a ground sheet pegged to hold over our heads, we were really comfortable. In seconds, I was dead to the world. The ground sheet pegged over our heads was pulled free and fell on my face, rousing me. Then a firm, warm hand seized one of mine and pulled me up into a sitting position. It was very early, as first sunshine was glittering on the dew-wet grass. I was annoyed that I should have to do some chore after being out so late. I tried to pull free, but the grip held, and as I came to a sitting up position, my other hand was seized, and I had a look at my visitor. In an instant, I was out of the bivvy, so surprised I could not speak. I was face to face with my brother, Steve, who'd been killed in 1915. The first notice from the War Office had said, "Missing, believed dead." After a time, one of his mates wrote to say a boot had been found with his name on it. The Germans had mined the Canadian trench and blown it up. Steve grinned as he released my hands, and then he put his warm hand over my mouth as I started to shout my happiness. He pointed to the sleepers in the bivvy and to my rifle and equipment. "Get your gear," he said softly. As I grabbed it, he turned and started walking away rapidly. It was hard to keep up with him. We passed makeshift shelters filled with sleeping men of my platoon. No one was awake. Now and then a gun fired off toward the Somme, or a machine gun chattered, but on the whole it was a quiet morning. As soon as we were past the shelters, I hurried to get close to Steve. "Why didn't you write Mother?" I asked. He turned, and the grin was still on his face. "Wait," he said. "Don't talk yet." Then I noticed he had a soft cap on and no gas mask or equipment. Somehow he had learned where the 42nd was and our D Company, but how in the world did he know where I was sleeping? We left the company area and headed directly into a collection of ruins that had been Petit Vimy. "There is no one around here," I said. "How did you know where to find me?" At that moment my equipment, slung hurriedly over one shoulder, slipped off and fell to the ground before I could catch it. As I stooped and retrieved it, Steve went into a passageway in the ruins, and I ran to catch him. Arrived there, I saw one way went right and the other left. Which way had he gone? "Steve!" I called. There was no answer, so I dropped my rifle and gear and ran to the right. It only took minutes, 2 or 3, to get to the far side, but there was no sign of my brother. I ran back and called again, took the way to the left, searched and searched again, called repeatedly, but could not find him. Finally, I sat down on my equipment and leaned back against a bit of wall. I was tired and sweating and excited. A great desire to find our officer and get the day off took hold of me, but I realized I did not know where the officer or sergeant major were, and if I left the immediate area and Steve returned, he would not know where I had gone. Probably he had no pass and didn't want to be seen. If only I'd not bothered with my equipment, I could have kept up with him. Minutes went by. I got up and made another search of the ruins. The sun began to glisten on the tops of the broken walls. I settled back more comfortably on my equipment and heard the usual morning stir of guns firing, registering shots. The sun got warmer. I dozed. Suddenly, I was shaken awake. Tommy had me by the arm and was yelling, "He's here! Bill's here!" I stumbled up, dazed, looked at my watch. It was 9 o'clock. "What's made you come here?" Tommy was asking. "What happened?" "What's all the row about?" I countered. "You should know. They're digging around that bivvy you were in. All they found is Jim's helmet and one of Bob's legs." "Legs?" I echoed stupidly. "What do you mean?" "Don't you know a big shell landed in that bivvy? They've been trying to find something of you." It seemed utterly incredible. I put on my gear and followed Tommy. There was a great cavity in the embankment, and debris was scattered over the whole area. Mickey came running to shake hands with me. Then the sergeant was calling, and I saw he was talking to an officer. When we got nearer, I saw it was an artillery officer of high rank, and I saluted him. "What made you leave the bivvy?" the sergeant asked. "The boys say you got in there with Jim and Bob." "I did," I said. "I was there till daylight." "What made you leave then?" It was the artillery officer who asked the question, and I hesitated. Felt it would sound foolish if I told them exactly what had happened. "Don't be afraid," he said. "We're all friends." He looked a real gentleman, so I told him my story in detail. He made notes in a book he carried, asking my name, where I was from, and all about Steve. Then he shook my hand. "You have had a wonderful experience," he said. I had seen Steve as clearly as I saw Mickey. His warm hands had pulled me from the bivvy. His voice had been perfectly natural. He had the old half grin I knew so well. He had saved my life. So that was the first time that Will had seen his brother Steve in the Great War after Steve had died. In his book, he recounts at least one other incident where the same situation happened. Steve had appeared to him. They were in a cellar of a bombed out house. Steve came, roused him, got him up and out of the house right before it was bombed, and everybody else had been killed. So on at least 2 occasions, Will had his dead brother come to him and save his life. So no man's land, that desolate few hundred yards between the trenches, was the ultimate manifestation of horror. Imagine the soundscape, if you can. The unending thump of artillery, the high-pitched ping of a sniper's bullet, and then the sheer, crushing silence that followed. It was in this silence that the mind began to betray the man. This ground was a cemetery without markers. Millions of shells had churned the earth, constantly unearthing and then reburying the dead. Soldiers were surrounded by the remains of their friends and their enemies, sometimes for months. The mud wasn't just dirt. It was a slurry of pulverized humanity and shattered steel. In this landscape, death was not hidden, it was everywhere. And that constant proximity to the unburied, the lost, fostered a unique folklore, a collective, desperate attempt to give meaning to an utterly senseless world. Or was it that? Perhaps it was not a manifestation of the mind at all. The stories that emerged were not merely superstitious tales, they were accounts shared by multiple, often hardened men. And one of the most common manifestations were the eerie lights, strange flickering glows, green or blue, floating above the shell craters at night. Soldiers called them the will-o'-the-wisps, spectral flares that moved with an unnatural, purposeful drift. Science, of course, offers an explanation. Marsh gas, methane and phosphine, naturally emitted from the decaying organic matter, and out in no man's land there was certainly enough decaying matter to fuel 1,000 lights. But for the soldier staring out from his miserable trench, those lights were not chemistry. They were the lanterns of the dead, guiding lost souls, or worse, luring the living to their doom. One British private wrote in his diary, quote, "I saw a light bobbing over the wire, green as a lantern, and I thought it was Jerry creeping forward, but it never came closer, and when I raised my rifle, it vanished." End quote. Then there was the sight of the phantom sentry. Men on watch would see a lone figure standing guard in the wire, often in a position no living man would risk, frozen, silent, sometimes for hours, dressed in the tattered uniform of either side. The moment a rifle was raised or a flare went up, the figure would simply cease to be there. This wasn't a trick of the mist, it was a deeply shared experience, suggesting an eternal duty being performed by the ghosts of those who had fallen at their posts. A Canadian soldier recalled, quote, "We thought it was one of ours, standing out there in the wire. When the flare went up, there was nothing, only the wind moving the strands." End quote. So these experiences weren't just morale-boosting fables. They were, in a lot of cases, probably a form of psychological coping. In a war where death was utterly random, these stories provided kind of a perverse sense of order, final dignity, like the dead were not simply gone, they were still here, still doing their bit, still watching. During the First World War, soldiers often found themselves surrounded not by comrades, but by the dead. James Reginald Glenn, who served with the 12th Battalion of the York and Lancaster Regiment, remembered one such moment. Standing in a field of skeletons, he and his fellow soldiers felt compelled to sing hymns. It was a haunting act of faith and defiance, an attempt to bring light into a place defined by silence and decay. So here's Glenn in his own words.
After July 1st, when we went up to Vimy, we came back to the Somme again before we went further north again, and we went over the same ground as we'd pushed the Germans back into Serre and beyond, and our padre and another officer and took me out onto what had been no man's land, and it was all covered with skeletons because they didn't have a chance to bury them. And so this officer said to our padre, "Can you say a prayer over these skeletons?" And he said, "We'll do that better than that. We'll sing a hymn." And so the three of us had got a hymn book, and all three of us sang on the resurrection morning. And the next morning, they were all covered with snow. So, and then after that, they'd come and collect them all and bury them.
For Canadian soldiers, the supernatural was not just a curiosity, it was woven into their experiences of the front. Some spoke of guardians, spectral comrades who appeared in moments of crisis. Others described the lost, figures wandering no man's land, endlessly searching for their unit, their trench, their home. These were not enemies nor allies, but shades, men who had died confused and whose spirits seemed condemned to patrol the wire forever. For some, the uncanny experiences of war, the ghostly apparitions, the cries in the dark, and the feeling of being stalked by unseen forces were interpreted through the lens of the Wetigo, the devouring spirit from the Algonquin tradition. The Wetigo was more than a monster. It embodied hunger, greed, and the terrifying transformation of human beings into something inhuman. In the chaos of no man's land, where men were reduced to survival instincts and death was everywhere, the Wetigo offered a way to explain what was happening. Now you can look at this from a couple of different perspectives. From the indigenous soldiers' views, the Wetigo was very, very real. This was not a coping mechanism. And for their Caucasian comrades, their British comrades, French comrades, perhaps this wasn't viewed that way. Perhaps the cries drifting across the battlefield were not just wounded men, but echoes of the Wetigo's hunt. Perhaps the sensation of being watched, of being hunted, was not only the enemy's snipers, but the spirit itself feeding on fear. For soldiers who saw comrades consumed by violence, or who felt war stripping away their humanity, the Wetigo became a metaphor for the battlefield itself, a devouring force that turned men into monsters. And maybe, in the churned mud and shattered earth of no man's land, the Wetigo found its perfect hunting ground, a place where hunger was endless, where death was constant, and where the boundaries between human and spirit, life and death, were blurred beyond recognition. The folklore of the trenches, will-o'-the-wisps, phantom sentries, guardians, and the lost was not fantasy. Sometimes it was survival. In a war that stripped men of control, these stories gave shape to the chaos. They offered dignity to the dead and meaning to the living. No man's land was not only a place of mud and wire, it was a place where the dead were left exposed, unreachable, and unclaimed. A graveyard. One of the most harrowing accounts comes from Albert Matthews of the 5th Battalion, Royal Berkshire Regiment.
I remember one instant when we were on sentry together on the left of Lewes at Hullock, little village of Hullock. Dick was on sentry looking over the parapet at night, and I was sitting on the firing step having a break, you see. That's how you used to do it, one up and one down. Dick whispered down to me, "Bert," he called me Bert. He says, "There's a German crawling up to our barbed wire." I says, "No, Dick." He says, "There is." He says, "I can see him moving." He says, "Come up here." So I get on this firing step beside of Dick. I said, "Where?" "Over there, look." And I looked, and of course, in those days, with your young eyes and that, you got accustomed to seeing pretty good in the dark. And in our barbed wire, you could see this sort of mass heaving about. It could have something like a man trying to wiggle under or through barbed wire. So we get our rifles ready, have a bang, and then I heard a noise. Well, I had heard it before, because there were swarms of them about there, tremendous great big rats. And I could hear the funny noise they were making. And there was a whole swarm of rats on this dead man, I think it was one of theirs, lying in our barbed wire, who'd been killed in the actual Battle of Lewes, you see. And this swarm of rats was gnawing and eating him away. And the next morning, when we looked over with our periscope, there was just his skeleton there. They'd eaten him all away in the night.
This was a sight that captured the true nightmare of no man's land, a place where men were not only killed by bullets and shells, but consumed by the battlefield itself. Military historian Tim Cook has documented a chilling story passed down from a nameless Canadian lieutenant involving a man he knew only as Private Rex. The lieutenant was leading his platoon away from the lines after days of brutal fighting. They were exhausted, mentally and physically shattered, trudging through mud and wire. He noticed one soldier, Private Rex, lagging behind the group. Rex looked profoundly pale, his face waxen, his movements slow, as though each step cost him dearly. Concerned, the lieutenant went back to check on him, and he offered Rex a piece of food. The lieutenant later recalled that Rex accepted the food with hands that were icy cold. His pallor was unnatural, his silence unsettling, but the officer pressed on, assuming the man was simply suffering from exhaustion. When they returned to camp, however, the lieutenant could no longer find his lagging comrade among the men. Puzzled, he asked after Private Rex. Another officer, a friend of the lieutenant, looked at him strangely. Then, with grim finality, he told him, "Rex? He was killed in action days ago. I was at his burial." The man with the icy cold hands, seen, spoken to, and remembered by a commissioned officer, was walking with his platoon. Was he a lost soul, still tied to the unit's march? Was he the lieutenant's mind, unable to process the endless deaths, or was he a fleeting, chilling visitation from the recently departed? Tim Cook noted that such crisis apparitions were not uncommon in the trenches. Soldiers reported seeing comrades who had already died, spectral figures who appeared at moments of exhaustion or peril, and these visions were deeply real to those who experienced them. As one veteran later reflected, "We lived so close to death that sometimes it seemed the dead walked beside us." End quote. So the memory of Private Rex remains suspended in the foggy gloom of no man's land, a reminder that in the Great War the dead were never far away. Sometimes they marched with the living. The Canadians experienced personal guardians, spectral brothers, phantom sentries. But on the French lines, particularly around the cauldron of Verdun, the spirit that manifested was an ancient collective one. Many French soldiers facing near total annihilation in 1916 reported seeing the old warrior of Verdun. He was described not as a ghost, but as a robust, athletic old man, a long white beard, rosy cheeks, and the uniform of a soldier from the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. He was not a shade of death, but a symbol of eternal French defiance. Veterans swore he appeared to exhausted marching troops, giving them a sudden, inexplicable surge of energy. One poilu recalled, "We were stumbling forward, half dead, when an old man with a beard walked beside us. He smiled, and I felt strength return to my legs." Other accounts claimed he led charges. Soldiers described seeing him for only a second, at the head of a bayonet thrust, urging men forward, before dissolving into the smoke. In the most poignant reports, he was said to bend over the wounded with a water bottle, offering a life-saving draught before vanishing. A French corporal later wrote, "I thought it was a comrade helping me, but when I looked again, there was no one, only the taste of water on my lips." For the French soldiers, this ghost was not a warning, he was a promise, a spirit of the nation itself watching over them, ensuring that the ground soaked in French blood since 1870 would not be given up. Verdun was a crucible of national identity. The old warrior embodied the continuity of sacrifice, linking the Franco-Prussian defeat of 1870 with the defiance of 1916. His presence reassured men that they were not alone and that the generations of French warriors stood beside them. Victory, it was often said, followed his appearance. So the old warrior of Verdun was more than folklore. He was a manifestation of collective endurance, a spectral embodiment of France itself. So where the Canadians saw guardians tied to family and comradeship, the French saw a protector tied to the nation. In the endless slaughter of Verdun, the old warrior was a reminder that the spirit of France could not be annihilated. The experiences we're discussing tonight cannot be separated from the psychological climate of the era. The Great War struck a generation already steeped in spiritualism and the occult. In the decades before 1914, seances were common. Mediums filled parlors, and belief in contact with the dead was widespread. Families longed for reassurance that loved ones lost to disease or accident were not truly gone. When the war came, that fascination collided with unprecedented loss. Millions of families sought solace in the idea that their sons might still be present, hovering just beyond the veil. The war introduced also a new term, shell shock. Soldiers exposed to constant concussive blasts, relentless noise, and overwhelming fear began to exhibit symptoms that we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. Tremors, nightmares, paralysis, and hallucinations were common. Extreme exhaustion, sensory overload, and fear are known today to induce vivid hallucinations. But for the soldiers themselves, men without the vocabulary of modern psychology, a ghost was maybe a far simpler, more comprehensible explanation than a fracturing mind. Who knows? Canadian historian Tim Cook, who had studied these accounts extensively, suggested that this spectral thinking was endemic to the Western Front. Maybe it was a way to make the strange ordinary, to infuse a deadly landscape with a sense of connection to something beyond the mud and the guns. Even veterans who denied seeing a full-blown apparition admitted to the pervasive feeling of presences. Many spoke of hearing faint, disembodied cries of men they knew had died days earlier. They would hear a name whispered on the wind, a sound impossible to trace, yet impossible to ignore. And it makes you wonder how much of this is just the mind playing tricks given the situation and the environment that they were living in, and how much of it could be echoes, like a rip in the fabric of time. Private George Ashurst of the Lancashire Fusiliers spoke about the hollowness of nighttime, especially while on sentry duty.
But in the night time, you're more awake really than you are in the day, you know, because you don't know what's happening in front there proper in the night time, and you're listening as well as looking, you know, and you can't see, but you're listening.
George Ashurst, nighttime was not a respite, but a different kind of battle. A struggle against imagination, dread, and the haunting presence of those who had already fallen. Others described the uncanny sensation of dread tied to certain places. One veteran recalled a particular road near the Somme. He said he was happy to walk away from it at night, but whenever he approached the old trench lines, he was overcome with sickness and fear. Quote, "It was as if the ground itself rejected me," he remembered. "I could not go forward." End quote. Canadian snipers, too, reported the distinct, unnerving feeling of being watched. an unseeing eye fixed upon them from across no man's land. The sensation lingered long after war ended, as though the battlefield itself had imprinted on their nerves. These were not easily dismissed. They were shared, repeated, and remembered, forming a collective folklore. Henry Williamson, who served with the London Rifle Brigade and later the Bedfordshire Regiment, often spoke of the strange, haunting quality of nights in the trenches. For him, nighttime was not just a pause in the battle. It was a time when the silence carried its own weight, when the darkness seemed alive with unseen presences. Here's Williamson, in his own words, recalling the night.
At night, one would hear the crackle of musketry far away. And then these, what I call the lilies of the dead, the flares going up and slowly sinking down and giving this powdery greenish light. They were sinking down under parachutes. German lights much better than ours. And they would come down the line, you'd see them, and you'd hear the machine guns going, and they'd sweep down, we'd be ordered to stand to, and we'd fire into no man's land, about 80 yards from the Germans. And we'd see perhaps figures darting about and coming forward and then lying flat and then going back.
Williamson's and Ashurst's memories of nighttime remind us that the war was not only fought in daylight assaults, but in long hours of waiting, listening, and fearing what might come out of the dark. For many soldiers, the night was when imagination and reality collided, when the battlefield felt haunted and the line between the living and the dead grew thin. The supernatural folklore of no man's land is one of the most poignant legacies of the Great War. It reminds us that war is fought not just with bullets and shells, but within the confines of the human mind. The stories of spectral sentries and flickering lights and icy-handed comrades are the only memorials for countless soldiers whose bodies were lost to the mud forever. Canadian veterans like Will Bird carried these chilling narratives home, forcing a nation to confront the fact that some experiences on the Western Front defied all logical explanation. Whether they were ghosts, hallucinations, or the raw, exposed nerves of men at the breaking point, they were real to those who lived and died in that spectral fray. On the German side, the stories often centered less on protective spirits and more on the profound, silent dread of a landscape saturated with death. The German term for no man's land, Niemandsland, literally translates to no one's land, a space owned by nobody, living or dead. It was a void, a place stripped of belonging where soldiers felt suspended between existence and oblivion. German accounts preserved in letters and diaries frequently highlight the intense psychological pressure that warped perception. Exhaustion, fear, and the constant presence of corpses created optical illusions. Men saw figures moving in the mist, shadows that seemed to advance, and lights that flickered with intent. They shared the terror of the wild men and the strange lights, but their literature often emphasized something darker. The horror not of phantoms, but of the real and the real experiences. So in the book All Quiet on the Western Front, Erich Maria Remarque describes the most disturbing image of all, the agonizing death of a wounded man caught in the barbed wire. Neither German nor Allied soldiers could reach him. For days, his cries echoed across the battlefield until they finally ceased. That silence was more haunting than any ghost. For German soldiers, the supernatural was not always external, it was internal. The ghosts they carried were born from their own actions. One German corporal, Stefan Westman, later recalled the profound, lasting psychological damage, not from a phantom, but from a moment of close quarter combat. He described having bayoneted a French soldier in the chest, watching him collapse, and then realizing with horror that he'd killed a man who looked no different from himself, describing the dead man's face as a ghost that followed him for the rest of his life.
I was quicker than he was. I tossed his rifle away and I ran my bayonet through his chest. He fell, put his hand on the place where I had hit him, and then I thrust again. Blood came out of his mouth and he died. I felt physically ill. I nearly vomited. My knees were shaking and I was, quite frankly, ashamed of myself. I woke up at night sometimes drenched in sweat because I saw the eyes of my fallen adversary, of the enemy, and I tried to convince myself what would have happened to me if I wouldn't have been quicker than he, what would have happened to me if I wouldn't have thrust my bayonet first into his belly.
For Westman, the ghost was not a spectral figure in the mist. It was the memory of the man he had killed, a silent, perpetual accusation carried within him. The German supernatural experience was often rooted in guilt. Where Allied soldiers spoke of guardians or angels, German accounts more often described dread, the sense that the dead lingered, not to protect, but to accuse. The ghosts they saw were reflections of conscience, a shadow in the wire, a face glimpsed in the mud, a cry remembered long after it had ceased. As one German veteran later wrote, quote, "The dead were always with us, not as spirits, but as memories that would not let us go." End quote. Across the Western Front, soldiers of every nation reported uncanny experiences. Canadians spoke of guardians, spectral comrades who appeared in moments of crisis. French troops at Verdun described the old warrior, the bearded veteran of 1870 who marched beside them, offering strength and water. British soldiers clung to the legend of the Angel of Mons, the collective vision of divine intervention that transformed retreat into survival. German accounts, by contrast, often centered on dread and guilt. Each nation's folklore reflected its psychological needs in some respects. The Canadians and the French sought guardianship and continuity. The British longed for divine reassurance, and the Germans wrestled with guilt and the silent accusations of memory. And when you look at it from that perspective, it becomes very, very interesting. No Man's Land itself became the crucible for these visions. You have to remember it was a landscape saturated with trauma, a graveyard without markers where the dead were constantly unearthed and reburied by the shell fire. And the mud wasn't just dirt, it was a slurry of pulverized humanity. In such a place, the boundary between the living and the dead seemed very porous. And the soldiers described these eerie lights, the phantom sentries, the voices on the wind, the sensation of being watched. So whether these were hallucinations born of exhaustion or genuine spiritual encounters, they were deeply real to those who experienced them. The very air of No Man's Land was charged with trauma. It became a catalyst for what some historians have called collective hallucination, shared visions from exhaustion, fear, and the desperate need for meaning. And yet others believe it was more than psychology, that the battlefield itself became a spiritual nexus, a place where sheer weight of suffering opened a door between worlds. So it was a graveyard, a wasteland, for many soldiers, a place that seemed to exist outside of life itself. Canadian voices told us of corpses tangled in barbed wire, of ghostly figures in the night, and of premonitions that foretold death. But British poet and officer Robert Graves added his own chilling testimony. In his memoir, Goodbye to All of That, he described No Man's Land as a place crawling with rats, quote, enormous, fat with human flesh, end quote. He remembered how men drowned in shell holes already filled with decomposing bodies and how the stench of decay clung to everything. Graves also noted the psychological toll. He wrote that the line between the living and the dead seemed blurred as soldiers trudged through the mud and corpses alike. Later, in reviewing another officer's memoir, he remarked that every account of trench warfare needed at least one ghost story because the uncanny was woven into the fabric of life at the front. For Canadian soldiers, superstition was woven into daily survival. Historian Tim Cook noted that men in the trenches developed what he called a death culture, where charms and rituals became psychological armor. Other Canadians described tokens from home, such as coins, crucifixes, and sweetheart brooches. British soldiers carried similar charms, but they also practiced trench rituals. One common habit was touching the fire step before going over the top. Veterans recalled brushing their hand against the wooden step as a gesture of luck and a way of asking the trench itself to carry them safely through. And then there was the superstition of the third cigarette. Soldiers believed it was fatal to light 3 cigarettes from the same match. As one account from October 1916 put it, it is very unlucky to light 3 cigarettes on one match. The logic was grimly practical. The first flame alerted the sniper, the second gave him time to aim, and the third spelled death. Gunner John Dickinson of the Royal Artillery carried a Bible in his breast pocket that stopped a bullet in 1915. He kept the torn book as proof of luck. Rifleman W.S. Main of the Rifle Brigade survived when a shell fragment smashed into his silver cigarette case, which absorbed the blow. And Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Bent of Royal Munster Fusiliers was saved from drowning in mud when he fell across the body of a dead German soldier. His twisted cigarette case became his talisman. These habits, touching the fire step, avoiding the third cigarette, clutching charms and tokens, were not trivial. They were lifelines. In a world where death was random, they gave order, meaning, and a fragile sense of protection. For Canadians and Britons alike, superstition was a way of saying, I'm not alone, I'm protected. Against the ghosts of no man's land, against the dread of silence and the cries of the dead, these charms and rituals were the soldiers' last defense. So the area between the opposing armies' trenches was known as no man's land, for good reason. 50 years after the war, Richard Tobin, who served with Britain's Royal Naval Division, recalled how he and his fellow soldiers entered no man's land as they tried to break through the enemy's line. As soon as you got over the top, he told an interviewer, fear has left you, and it's terror. You don't look, you see. You don't hear, you listen. Your nose is filled with fumes and death. You taste the top of your mouth. You're hunted back to the jungle. The veneer of civilization has dropped away.
The bullets were hitting the trees and the objects around us all night, you see. But there was something which I didn't tell you there, which is worthy of putting on record. On the night that I crawled up to find that front line, when I got back about 9:30, I was standing at the head of my ambulances, waiting for my officer to turn up, and up in the tree was a nightingale singing his heart out. Now, if ever there was a bizarre situation, fancy that one. Death going on down below on the ground, spare bullets coming over, knocking against the trees all over, and there was this bird up there singing his heart out in the darkness.
I'd like to thank you for joining me on this episode of podcast Memory and Valor. Again, I appreciate all of you who take the time to listen, and I thank you for being here and visiting my website at www.memoryandvalor.ca. If you'd like to learn more about the Great War, you can definitely check that out on my website. And I've also got some stuff constantly being updated on the Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok pages. They're all titled Memory and Valor, making them easy to find. And remember, that's Valor with an O-U-R. Please take a moment to like, follow, rate the podcast, and share any of the content that you enjoy. It really helps to raise awareness. My books are also available for purchase on Amazon. And in addition, I also offer a service to create legacy books or tribute books, which is sort of a immersive and meaningful way to honor your loved ones, military or not. So next time on Memory and Valor, I believe we are going to look at the endurance of Huey John MacDonald, the endurance of a runner in the Great War. And Huey John MacDonald just happens to be my best friend's grandpa. So this is kind of the cool thing to know somebody in my age group whose granddad was actually in the First War as a runner and survived. We are going to talk about that, and we're going to have Huey MacDonald's grandson here as our first guest on this podcast. So join me next time. It'll be me and John MacDonald, Huey's namesake. We're going to talk about the tribute book that I've created for his granddad and the story that goes with that. And it's a really interesting one, guys. I think you'll enjoy it. So until then, keep history alive, for where memory endures, valor lives on.